Okay, today we're going to talk about 27-2. World War II is beginning. So let's see. First, let's start with Germany is attacking Poland. If you remember, that was their plan, and they didn't want to make the Soviet Union mad, so Hitler made a deal with him, remember? So they go ahead with their plan. He attacks Poland September 1st of 1939. Great Britain and France had already told Poland that they would come to their aid, right? They had an alliance. So, of course, as soon as that does happen, Britain and France also declare war on Germany, and they start mobilizing and seeing if they can go help Poland. But unfortunately, the Germans moved so fast and so heavily and quickly. It's called Blitzkrieg when it's called a lightning war, right? That could happen so fast, and they did everything all at once: planes, tanks, troops. And so it was so hard and fast that the Polish could not, you know, keep them out, and the British and the French couldn't come to help fast enough. So Poland falls. Okay, and remember, Hitler and Stalin had made that deal that they were going to split up Poland, and they go ahead and do that. Also, Stalin at the same time is forcing themselves on Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. He makes them allow Soviet military bases so he can use them and take them over eventually. Finland is trying really hard to hold out and fights hard against the Soviet Union, but they're not able to, and they actually get taken over too in March of 1940. I'm putting a lot of dates just so you can kind of keep track of what that's happening. Okay, so let's move over to the other side. So, of course, the British and the French are getting ready for the next war, and they assume that this next battle is going to happen in France, right? The last time they fought, it would happen, the fighting against the border of France and Germany, if you recall, from World War I. So they expect that. So they spend a lot of time and effort building up what they call the Maginot Line. Along the border, steel and concrete bunkers, and they sit and they wait. The troops are all ready and they wait all winter, and the Germans never come. They decided, the Germans, not to attack there, but to instead move north. So they attack Denmark and Norway, and then Netherlands and Belgium. And the Belgians tried again to really hard to stop them, but and the Allies tried to help the Belgians, but it just, they were overwhelmed. And there's a famous story about Dunkirk, which some of you may have seen the movie. This is when the Allied troops who were retreating, they were trapped between the Germans and the coast of the English Channel, and there was nowhere for them to go. And they made this really brave rescue attempt, and what this picture is of the British sent over across the English Channel 800 different ships, warships, ferries, fishing boats, whatever they could get their hands on, and they came and trying to rescue as many soldiers as they could and bring them to safety. So British and French soldiers. So that's a pretty famous event. The Germans kept going into France after that, right, in about June. And then the Italians also joined the Germans, and they also worked to attack the French from the southeastern corner. And so the French are getting it on all sides, and pretty much they tried to put up a fight, but eventually in June 14th, the Germans march into Paris, and within a week, the French have to surrender to the Germans. Okay. All right. So the Germans next go after Britain. Great Britain is pretty much the last big one that they need to fight. So the Germans start, again, a lot of bombing. You can see in the picture they bombed not only targets that you would expect, like air bases and shipyards and factories, but they also bombed the cities, and so civilians were at risk. And so there would be air raids, and when you heard you had to go try to hunker down and hope it didn't, come on your building. So a lot of civilians were killed. The the Germans thought that was on purpose. They thought that would make it so terrible, right, that they would give up. But Prime Minister Winston Churchill gets a lot of credit, keeping everyone's spirits up and saying, no, we're not going to give in to this, and we're going to fight. And the British Royal Air Force did a really good job in fighting back, and they did cause the Germans heavy losses, so much so that eventually Hitler gives up when it becomes October, right? And they're not winning. It's been going on, and so he thinks it's not worth his times and effort. So he changes his mind, and he starts now attacking the Soviet Union, which, if you recall, he had a deal with the Soviet Union, Stalin, right? And he was not supposed to do that, but he goes against his word, and he decides he needs the Soviet Union's resources and their land for living space, he called it, right? For his big empire and all his correct people that he was going to, have live, like the German people. He wanted them to have the land spread out, okay? So he decides he's going to go after the Soviet Union. And early on, that did look like it was going well. The Germans were winning a lot of battles, destroying a lot of planes, captured about 500,000 soldiers. And so the Soviets are not looking like they're doing well. So Stalin, and if you remember, Stalin is quite ruthless. He orders a scorched earth policy. And if you remember that from the Civil War, scorched earth is when you order that you burn everything that's usable, even if it's like you could use it, your own people could use it. You ruin it so that the other side can't use it. Okay, so they're burning cities and crops, and regular people are starving, right? And it's ruining their lives. And a lot of people died, his own people, Stalin, during this time. But he, it is unfortunately a strategy, right? That he is getting rid of anything that the Germans could use. So it makes it a lot harder for them to supply their troops and keep going and invading. They even blew up dams for electric power. So imagine, like, if you're the people, right, left behind, right? So it was a very desperate and harsh method to use, but it did seem to work. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit more next time as we talk. I'm kind of going chronologically right now. Okay, and then in the meantime, in the United States, we are trying to stay out of it, right? Most of the people in America, I would say, would agree that they were wanting to be on the Allies' side, but more so they want to stay out of the war. And in fact, here's an example. The American First Committee is a group that was isolationists, and they were very popular, and they're, trying to get everyone to know that you should stay out of Europe's problems. We have our own things to worry about, okay? And so even though Roosevelt is promising to stay out of the war and stay neutral, on the same token, he and Congress are still preparing. So in 1938, you see Congress increasing the size of the Navy in preparation. In 1939, they revised the Neutrality Acts. If you remember, it said that you couldn't trade with other countries or at war because you're afraid you're going to get drawn in. Well, this time they're saying, well, you can if the U.S. Gets their money in cash, and you have to move the goods with your own ships. We don't want to risk our own ships getting attacked like in other wars, right? And then in 1940, Roosevelt gave the British 50 destroyers in exchange for leases on 8 British military bases. So that shows that obviously we're wanting to help the British. We didn't want to commit our own troops right now, but we're giving them definitely war effort, right? The destroyers. And then the selective Service Act, the Training and Service Act. This is the first time we've put this in place during a peacetime, right? We have not officially declared war yet. We're committing all men have to sign up for the draft from 21 to 35 years old. And the way the draft works is if your number is picked, which is what that picture is, right? There's these little capsules, and they had a number. Each local area, had to register all the men ahead of time, and then they assign them all a number. And if your number was picked, then you have to go register or show up, and then they'll assign you to go to training, right? And then in 1940, so that shows we're getting our troops ready, right? It's pretty clear that means we know we're probably going to end up going to war. In the 1940 presidential election, Roosevelt decides to run for a third term. Now remember, up until this point, there was no law or amendment that said that you could only go for 2 terms. It was all tradition, right? Everyone just went 2 terms because that's what Washington did. But he says, it's during this terrible upheaval time and war, we're at brink of war. So it's true, people didn't want to, try someone else they didn't know at that point. So they voted for him, and he did get a third term. And of course, now we know that we have an amendment that limits it to 2 now. Okay, March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act is another example of how we're kind of changing our ideas. It said the U.S. can sell, lend, or lease weapons to any country that they think is vital to our defense. Isolationists, again, are opposed to this idea because it's pretty clear that if you start selling weapons or, giving weapons to other countries, that's going to get you drawn into the conflict, okay? All right, so and little by little, you see us getting a little more and more involved. Roosevelt told the Navy to protect British ships when they're close to American shores, right? That's showing that we're helping them and protecting them. And then some German ships did fire on U.S. ships, and so then he says, okay, well then now you can shoot down German and Italian ships in certain areas. So it's clearly, getting more and more closer to war. And then just a little side thing, the Atlantic Charter, there was also something that was put in by Roosevelt and Churchill, Winston Churchill from Great Britain. This was a non-military alliance. So they said in this meeting that they were making goals for after the Nazis were destroyed, and basically like trying to plan how they can stop this from happening again. So they're both agreeing that, we should get countries to disarm, right? Disarmament is when you give up your weapons so that there's not that buildup of threatening, right? And then they wanted to come up with some kind of permanent system for peace. So they didn't really say exactly what that was, but it just shows that they are aligned on the same side and kind of saying we're against what's happening over on that other side, right? Okay, all the while all this is all happening, Japan is doing its own thing. So Japan takes advantage, right? The Germans have beaten the French. Oh, so remember, the Japanese, their big thing all along has been that they want to go get more colonies, remember, in China and everything. So there's, in China, right, there's the French-controlled area. Great, France is beaten by the Germans. We're going to take over even more of that land, okay? They also plan to take over the Dutch East Indies. The British have some territory. The Philippines is American territories. So they're planning to kind of take over all the other people's colonies, right? So they're being threatening in that way. So Roosevelt is not going to stand for the Japanese doing these things. So he starts doing what he can without declaring war, right? He freezes all Japanese funds in U.S. banks, and he stops the sale of gasoline and some other things to the Japanese to try to hamper their efforts and to kind of punish them. And of course, the Japanese are not happy about this. They had a prime minister who wanted to try to, work it out with the U.S. because he was very concerned that the U.S. He didn't think that the Japanese could beat the U.S. But remember we talked about General Tojo. He disagreed, and remember how the generals have a lot of power in Japan, and basically he forced the prime minister to resign. In the meantime, they do go ahead with these supposed talks in Washington, but unbeknownst to us, those were all just to like appease us and make us not know what they were really doing was planning this surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which I'm sure you've heard of. Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The Japanese, early on a Sunday morning on December 7th, 1941, they attack and bomb the U.S. military base. So their ships all lined up nicely and, right there in the harbor. And then there's these planes are all lined up and they bomb those, and they kill a lot of people, right? There's a lot of sailors and soldiers on this military base. There's these civilians. There's hospitals, right? And so about 2,300 soldiers are killed, or people are killed, and then about 1,000 are injured. So it was unprovoked attack, right? And so we immediately, Roosevelt says it's a date which will go down in infamy, right? Because it was such a heinous attack. And so basically that you can tell, like, we're going to get into it now that we've been attacked directly. And the Japanese, of course, join the Germans and the Italians, and they're going to be the Axis powers. And then, of course, we're going to join the Allies' power. Okay, and we'll talk about the Allies and the continued war next time.